Over 6 months ago, I described my vision for my scratch-built Sheridan hotel. In today's video, we'll all see how well I have achieved that vision as I add sidewalks and a balcony to the hotel. Welcome back to my channel, and as always, thanks to my subscribers. I started with the sidewalks. Since the sidewalks will be glued on a door shim to provide a slope, getting that slope defined will be critical to making sure the balcony fits properly. I glued 2 pieces of Bar Mills brick sidewalk to the door shim. I'm using Aleene's tacky glue here. Notice that the sidewalks don't cover the entire width of the shim. That's okay. That leftover width will form one edge of the street. I carefully wiped any excess glue away from the sidewalk castings. Painting these sidewalks will be very similar to painting the brick walls. The challenge is to make sure the brick colors do not turn out to be too similar. I started with a deep red color, in this case apple barrel barn red. I was careful to paint the entire brick surface. Next, I applied an uneven coat of raw sienna. I did not try to cover all of the first red coat. Then I applied a very thin and also uneven coat of folk art pure orange. This is just to add some lighter tones to the brick. When everything had dried, I applied a thin wash of India ink. This wash will tone down all the colors, and it will settle into the cracks and crevices and emphasize the brick texture. When the wash was dry, I dry brushed a very little apple barrel light mocha. If you apply too much, your sidewalk will look like it has just snowed, so use restraint here. Unfortunately, when I was finished, I didn't care for the appearance of the sidewalk. These sidewalks are really weathered, and there are gaps in the bricks that are several scale inches deep. Placing a scale figure on this sidewalk, you can see that this sidewalk is an HO scale broken ankle waiting to happen. This would work well in the Skid Row section of an inner city, but I felt like I needed a less weathered appearance. So I dug out some downtown deco brick sidewalks I had on hand. The castings are a little thicker than the Bar Mills castings, but I can mount the building on some shims to offset the difference in thickness. As you can see, there is some casting flash on the edges of this casting. Since these are cast in hydrocal, they are very easy to work with. You can use a razor saw, sandpaper, even a hobby knife. You can even distress the casting to add cracks or missing bricks. The downtown deco sidewalks are just over 11 feet wide. This is too wide for my street, so my first task was to cut the sidewalk pieces to a 7-foot width. Hydrocal castings are easy to trim with a razor saw, as you can see here. Hydrocal castings need to be sealed before painting, otherwise the castings just soak up the paint. I used Tamiya primer to seal the castings, but any cheap spray paint will work just as well. When the primer had dried, I brushed on an uneven coat of raw sienna. When the raw sienna had dried, I brushed on an uneven coat of terracotta. These 2 colors are very similar, so the final effect is very subtle, but there are still color variations in the brick. After the color had dried, I brushed on a thin wash of raw umber. This wash settles in the details of the casting and brings out the texture. Once the wash is completely dry, Downtown Deco recommends lightly brushing the entire casting with fine steel wool. This removes paint from the high points of the casting and creates some very subtle highlights. I painted the curbs using Vallejo 71.296 USAAF Light Gray, Vallejo 71.045 Cement Gray, and Vallejo 71.131 Concrete. Apply a coat of water first, then dab on the colors in an irregular pattern. You can always wipe off excess color with a cotton swab. Use these colors in any order you like until you get the desired effect. While the sidewalk castings were drying, I painted one side of a regular door shim a simple earth color. This paint will eventually get covered by the street paving. Once the sidewalk castings were dry, I glued them to the door shim to create the slope at the front of the building. I built the balcony using scale stripwood from Northeastern Scale Lumber. If you prefer to use dimensional stripwood, I have provided a conversion table in the video description below. I start all of my stripwood projects by staining full lengths of stripwood. Once the stain has dried, I will cut the various pieces to length. You can glue stained stripwood together easily, but if you glue first, the stain won't take at the glue joints, and you'll be left with unstained joints. Once the stain had dried, I cut the 1x6 wood into 4-inch lengths. I can get 3 pieces from each 12-inch piece of 1x6, and I need a total of 14 lengths. I cut 4 lengths of 2x10, exactly 26 feet 6 inches long. That's the width of the building front. Next, I placed 2 pieces of double-sided tape about 3 3/4 inches apart. Then I placed the cut 1x6 pieces across the 2 pieces of tape, keeping the adjoining pieces tightly together. Stripwood usually has one side that is smoother than the other, and that difference is enhanced by staining. I was careful to place the smoother sides down, since I built the deck upside down. If you want to model a more decrepit balcony, you should trim some of the edges of the decking to simulate split boards, or even break 1 or 2 of the boards. This will allow the joists to show through and will look very realistic. I glued 2 of the 26.5-foot lengths of 2x10 together to form a single 4x10 piece. I allowed it to dry under weight to keep it from warping. I did the same for the other 2 pieces. These 4x10s will form the front and back headers for the deck support. I glued one of the headers to the back of the decking, using machinist squares to brace it as close to vertical as I could get. While that piece was drying, I cut about 30 2x10 joists. The decking I had laid on the cutting mat was about 7 feet 8 inches wide, so cutting the joists to 7-foot lengths left just enough room for the front and back headers. Once the back header was dry, I glued 2 joists together and glued the pair to the decking at one end of the header, using a small drafting triangle to make sure they were square. Then I repeated that at the other end. Starting at each end and working toward the middle, I glued 1 joist at a time to the decking, using a short length of 1/8 inch square styrene as a spacer. The styrene will not bond to the white glue, so it is easy to remove the spacer once the joist is firm. After the glue had dried on the end joists, I used a single-edge razor blade to slice the excess length off of the decking, as shown here. And here is the complete deck. Notice that I have not attached the front header. That comes a little later. I used Inkscape to create a template for the front support structure for the deck. I drew simple, full-sized rectangles and pieced them together to form the supports. I have used different colors here to emphasize the different rectangles. Once I was happy with the design, I grouped the rectangles together and scaled them down by a factor of 87. The resulting shape fits easily on a sheet of 8.5 by 11 paper, and I printed it as you see here. I started by gluing the front header to the paper using very tiny dots of glue. Once that had set, I glued the posts in position using a tiny dot of glue on the back of each post at the bottom to hopefully hold a 90-degree angle. I used the template to cut 10 angle braces and glued 6 of them in position, as you see here. I'll use the remaining 4 braces on the sides of the deck support. When the glue had set, I carefully sliced the assembly away from the template. There was a little paper still glued to the back side of the assembly, and I decided to touch this up with a little paint, rather than chance breaking the assembly by scraping or sanding the paper. Next, I glued the 4 rear support posts to the side of the building. I took great care to get the length of each post correct. The post must support the deck in the correct position at the top, and it must exactly touch the sloping sidewalk at the bottom. I used masking tape to locate these 2 edges, and I cut each post to the correct length. I also painted the posts on 3 sides before attaching them to the front wall. Next, I painted the deck and glued the front post assembly to the front of the deck. I braced the post assembly to keep it square with the deck. Once the glue had set, I glued the angle braces on either side of the deck front. After a quick check to be sure everything fit perfectly, I glued the rear of the deck to the main structure and braced it while the glue set. Once the glue had set, I glued the last two angle braces in place and painted the rest of the deck. I did not paint the underside of the deck. I left the wood stain showing. Now for the moment of truth. After measuring very carefully, I drilled 4 holes in the door shim, positioned to receive the 4 balcony support posts. Then I placed the building in position with the balcony spanning the sidewalk. This is where all of that planning and all of that careful measuring and cutting pay off. As you can see, the fit is perfect. The balcony support posts on the building front appear to rest on the sidewalk, and the front balcony posts are perfectly aligned and vertical. I confess I heaved a sigh of relief at this point. Now it's time to assemble the balcony railing. I used Tichy number 8093 turned spindle porch rail. Despite the fact that these railings are nicely detailed and beautifully made, assembling the railings turned out to be the hardest part of the entire project. The railings have to be cut to fit the balcony, and this required careful measuring and precise sanding to be sure all of the railings were the proper length and the railing ends were perfectly square. Also, you can see in this close-up that the newel posts have a slight mold separation line. This separation line keeps the post from being square and must be sanded flat to ensure a good glue joint. Also, the handrail and the base rail are different widths, so it will not be sufficient to glue both rails flush with one edge of the newel posts. Finally, the newel posts are about 4 scale inches taller than the railing assembly, so the railings need to be glued to the newel posts at a consistent height. I decided to build a construction jig to hold all of the parts in proper alignment while I glued the railings together. In fact, I built 3 so I could assemble the front railing in a single step. Once the front and side railings had been glued, I used a 1-2-3 block to hold the railings at 90-degree angles to each other and to the base, and I glued the side railings to the front railing. Once the glue had cured, I primed and painted the railing assembly and glued it into position on the balcony. Well, it's been quite a journey. I started this project almost 7 months ago, and it has taken me 5 videos to document my progress. Along the way, I recorded over 100 video clips totaling more than 5 hours of time and took countless still photos. So the question now is, did I achieve my vision? That's a question any modeler has to ask him or herself, but I feel like I have captured the spirit of the prototype building. But I had a second objective in producing these videos. I wanted to demonstrate how any modeler, with time and patience, could use fairly simple tools and readily available materials to produce a unique structure, and I wanted to inspire others to undertake their own projects. Have I achieved that objective? Only you, the viewer, can answer that question. But I am not yet finished with this building. Even though you have seen the time and effort that went into this project, a visitor to my layout would look at this building and not see anything special. There is nothing to catch that visitor's eye and spark their imagination. In the next and final part of this series, I will show how the addition of a few simple details will capture that viewer's interest and draw them closer into the layout. I have included links to all the products mentioned in this video in the description below. As always, I would love to hear your comments and questions. If you want to see more videos of this type, be sure to subscribe and hit that like button. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.